You have no friends because you're incapable of connection. You have no friends because, somewhere along the way, closeness became unsafe. You learned to sit quietly in rooms where your presence wasn't required, to listen more than speak, to take up as little space as possible. Each time you reached out and felt nothing return, you adjusted. You told yourself you didn't need much. You convinced yourself solitude was preference, not adaptation. Now, silence feels lighter than expectation, and distance feels calmer than hope. People assume you chose this life. They think you prefer being alone. But beneath the calm is a paradox most never see. You didn't reject friendship. You survived its absence. Some people unravel when they're alone. You don't. You can move through days, sometimes weeks, without meaningful social contact and feel stable, not happy, not fulfilled, just contained. Silence doesn't frighten you. Empty rooms don't trigger panic. If anything, they lower the noise inside your body. What unsettles you isn't solitude. It's interaction, the constant adjustment, the reading between lines, the effort of being emotionally present in spaces where presence feels conditional. When you're alone, nothing is required. You don't have to perform interest. You don't have to manage tone. You don't have to prove your value through responsiveness. Aloneness doesn't drain you, it regulates you. And when emotional exhaustion becomes familiar, neutrality starts to feel like peace. This pattern didn't begin in adulthood. It began quietly, long before you had language for it. Classrooms where you weren't the obvious choice. Playgrounds where groups formed without noticing you weren't included. Family gatherings where your presence changed nothing. You weren't bullied. You weren't directly rejected. You were simply unnecessary. People didn't push you away. They just didn't pull you in. And because there was no clear rejection, you couldn't justify the hurt. So you minimized it. You told yourself you were independent, mature, fine on your own. At first, it was a coping strategy. Over time, it became your personality. You learned how to stay without being seen. You became quieter not because you lacked thoughts, but because sharing them rarely shifted your place in the room. You learned that being agreeable created fewer ripples, that being low maintenance made people more comfortable. So you reduced yourself, not dramatically, not consciously, just enough to avoid disappointment. If you didn't expect inclusion, you couldn't feel excluded. If you didn't reach, nothing could fail to reach back. And slowly, invisibility began to feel safer than exposure. People who grow up without consistent friendship develop a specific kind of strength, one that isn't celebrated. Emotional self-containment. You learned to process pain internally, to calm yourself without reassurance, to celebrate quietly because no one else noticed the moment mattered, to grieve privately because grief without witnesses felt easier than explaining it. You didn't stop needing people. You stopped expecting them. From the outside, this looks like resilience. From the inside, it feels like carrying everything alone because there was never another option. In social spaces, you rarely lead. You watch. You notice who dominates conversations, who performs confidence, who fades when ignored. You read micro-expressions, pauses, shifts in tone. You sense exclusion before it's obvious. And because you see so much, you hesitate to step forward. Speaking feels risky. Being misunderstood feels inevitable. Visibility feels like exposure without protection. So you remain polite, composed, slightly distant. Not because you lack warmth, but because awareness taught you caution. People often say, just make friends, as if proximity guarantees connection. But you've tried surface-level bonds. You've been the listener, the emotional support, the background presence. You've felt how quickly interest fades when convenience disappears. You don't crave constant company. You crave depth. And when depth isn't available, withdrawal feels honest, not bitter, not dramatic, just aligned with reality. There wasn't a decision, no final disappointment, no dramatic cutoff. You simply stopped trying as hard. You initiated less. You explained less. You hoped less. Because hoping had become heavier than being alone, trying taught you one lesson repeatedly. Effort doesn't guarantee connection. So conserving energy felt wiser than chasing belonging. This is how solitude became familiar, how distance became default. But adaptation always has a cost. Because having no friends isn't just about being alone. It's about what happens to a person when connection feels unreliable for too long. That's where the story deepens. From the outside, you appear independent, self-sufficient, low maintenance, comfortable on your own. People admire it. They assume it came from confidence. But this independence wasn't chosen, it was learned. It came from repetition, from noticing that waiting didn't change outcomes, that needing others didn't guarantee response. That vulnerability often meant silence. So you stopped relying, not angrily, not consciously. You adjusted. Independence became the safest way to move through a world that felt emotionally inconsistent. For you, friendship feels like effort. Not because people are cruel, but because history taught you to overfunction. You listen carefully. You remember details others forget. You show up consistently. You become the stable one. And slowly, you notice something uncomfortable. The imbalance. You notice how rarely others initiate, how little curiosity is returned, how often your presence feels optional. At some point, a quiet question forms. Why am I always carrying this? And when that question goes unanswered, distance feels lighter than resentment. There's a kind of grief that doesn't announce itself. Moments when something happens, good or bad, and there's no one to tell. No one who understands the context. No one who knows why this moment matters. You sit with news alone. Achievements feel muted. Pain feels heavier. Not because you want attention, but because humans are wired to share. And when sharing isn't possible, everything echoes inward. You didn't decide to withdraw. It happened quietly. Messages took longer to reply to. Plans were suggested less often. Invitations weren't initiated. Not out of bitterness, but fatigue. Each attempt at connection required emotional energy with no guarantee of return. And eventually, conserving energy felt wiser than chasing inclusion. People sometimes notice something about you. You don't seem to miss people. You don't long for company. You don't feel restless without plans. But this isn't numbness. It's conditioning. You learned how to detach without breaking, how to adjust to absence without protest. Missing people requires expecting their presence, and expectation learned to stay low. When people learn you have no friends, assumptions follow. That you must be cold, difficult, emotionally closed. They don't see the reality. That people with no friends are often highly perceptive, emotionally sensitive, deeply introspective, selective because they have to befriend. You didn't fail socially. You adapted to inconsistency. Being alone feels predictable. No shifting moods. No emotional negotiations. No sudden withdrawal. Solitude doesn't misunderstand you. It doesn't disappoint you. It doesn't require explanation. And after years of relational uncertainty, predictability feels safe, even if it's quiet, even if it's heavy. Contrary to what others think, your fear isn't rejection. It's hope. Hope that rises slowly, then collapses sharply. You learned that expecting connection hurts more than never expecting it at all. So you manage expectations carefully, detached, controlled. Hope feels reckless. People like you often feel aged, not physically, existentially. You learned early how to self-regulate, how to self-soothe, how to emotionally support yourself. While others learn through shared experience, you learned alone. Solitude matures you, but it also hardens. This is how being alone became efficient, functional, normal. But beneath the adaptation, something remains unresolved, a quiet tension between endurance and longing. And that tension is where the story continues. You can be around people. You know how to behave. You understand social rhythm. You're polite, responsive, appropriate. But emotionally, you stay slightly outside. You listen more than you share. You respond more than you initiate. You participate without attaching. Not because you don't care, but because attachment feels like risk. You've learned how to remain present without being invested, a skill that protects you and quietly isolates you. Your loneliness doesn't match the stereotype. It isn't dramatic. It doesn't beg. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up as emotional flatness, muted reactions, a sense of watching life rather than entering it. You don't feel lonely in crowds. You feel separate, like everyone else is participating in something. You're observing through glass. Despite everything you've adapted to, something remains. A quiet desire. Not for popularity, not for constant company, but for one person who sees you without effort. Someone who doesn't require explanation. Someone who doesn't need emotional management. Someone whose presence doesn't feel like work. You rarely admit this desire, because wanting what you've learned to survive without feels dangerous. You don't fear being alone. You fear the moment you stop being okay with it. Wanting introduces vulnerability, and vulnerability reopens old patterns. Hope, for you, is destabilizing. It raises expectations. It creates emotional exposure. It invites disappointment. So you keep your needs small, your desires quiet, not because they aren't real, but because they were never reliably met. There's a private conversation you have with yourself. It sounds like, "It's fine. I'm used to this. I don't need anyone." And most of the time, it works. Until something slips through. A shared laugh you witness from a distance. A conversation that reminds you what connection can feel like. A sudden awareness that no one truly knows your inner world. Then the silence feels heavier. You don't chase connection, not because you don't value it, but because you learned what chasing costs. You learned how easily effort becomes invisible, how often interest isn't mutual, how quickly imbalance forms. So you stopped reaching, not as punishment, not as withdrawal meant to be noticed, but as self-preservation. People often assume you're closed off, that you don't let anyone in. But the truth is quieter. You feel deeply. You think intensely. You notice everything. You're not closed. You're cautious. Because opening without safety is something you learn to regret. At some point, solitude stopped being situational. It became identity. This is just how I am. I've always been like this. I function better alone. And maybe that's partly true. But identity formed through adaptation is not the same as identity formed through choice. You became this way because you had to. Self-reliance looks admirable, but it carries an invisible cost. It means no one checks in unless you initiate. No one notices when things feel heavy. No one knows when you're struggling. You carry everything quietly. because you've learned how. Here's the paradox beneath everything. You function alone. You survive. You cope. You manage. But functioning is not the same as living fully. You've mastered endurance. Not because you wanted to, but because it was necessary. This is where the contradiction sharpens. Because beneath the calm exterior, beneath the discipline and emotional restraint, there's something unresolved. A question you rarely allow yourself to ask. Not about survival, but about what was never received. There's a question you avoid. Not because you don't feel it, but because you've learned how destabilizing it can be. It's not, why am I alone? It's, what did I not receive? Because that question forces you to look backward, to notice patterns you learned to normalize. Moments when emotional presence was inconsistent, when care was conditional, when closeness required silence, compliance, or self-erasure. So instead of asking, you adapted. For many people who have no friends, connection was unpredictable early on. Sometimes warmth was available. Sometimes it vanished without explanation. You learned not to rely on it. You learned how to stay emotionally upright without leaning. Not because you wanted independence, but because dependence felt risky. And over time, inconsistency taught you something powerful. Expect less, feel less, need less. Even when the past feels distant, your body remembers. The hesitation before opening up, the tightness when someone gets too close, the urge to pull back the moment things feel real. This isn't logic, it's memory. Your nervous system learned when closeness was followed by absence, when vulnerability didn't lead to safety. So now, solitude feels regulated. Connection feels activating. Distance gives you control. You decide when to engage, when to withdraw, when to be seen. There are no surprises in solitude, no sudden emotional shifts, no unspoken expectations, no risk of being forgotten while still present. Distance doesn't abandon you. It stays exactly where you leave it. You're often described as calm, grounded, unaffected. But that calm is earned. It comes from constant emotional monitoring, from suppressing reactions before they surface, from keeping feelings contained instead of expressed. You've learned how to appear steady, even when something inside feels heavy. And over time, composure replaces expression. People may feel connected to you. They may enjoy your presence, appreciate your listening, rely on your stability, but you rarely feel truly close. Because closeness, for you, requires safety, not just proximity. And safety was never guaranteed, so you stay slightly removed, even when surrounded. Repeated emotional disappointment does something subtle. It lowers expectation. You stop imagining shared futures. Stop assuming continuity. Stop believing people will stay. This doesn't make you pessimistic. It makes you precise. You learn how not to overestimate connection. When you see others bond easily, you don't feel envy. You feel tired. Because you understand the emotional labor behind connection. And you know how often it isn't reciprocated. It's not bitterness. It's realism shaped by experience. In relationships, you often become the listener, the supporter, the emotionally stable one. You hold space, but rarely feel held. Because somewhere along the way, you learn that needing support was more risky than providing it. Extended solitude doesn't just change habits, it reshapes identity. You begin to define yourself through self-reliance, through independence, through emotional containment. I don't need much. I'm fine on my own. And over time, these statements stop being defenses. They become beliefs. This is the deeper cost of having no friends. Not loneliness, but the quiet reshaping of who you believe you are. And in the final part, we arrive at the truth beneath it all. Not a solution, not a lesson, but recognition. People often ask the wrong question. They ask, why don't you have friends? But the real question is, why did connection stop feeling safe? Because people who have no friends are rarely incapable of connection. They are often deeply capable, just selectively open. They didn't lose the ability to bond. They learned when not to. You may want connection, but wanting isn't the same as readiness. Readiness requires something deeper than loneliness. It requires trust in continuity, in emotional reliability. And that trust was disrupted long ago. So even when the desire is present, your system hesitates. Not because you're broken, but because you adapted. This is the part few people understand. Solitude wasn't chosen out of weakness. It was chosen out of intelligence. It reduced emotional volatility. It eliminated unpredictable pain. It restored a sense of control. Solitude worked, and that's why it stayed. Advice fails when it ignores history. You can't override years of emotional learning with surface-level encouragement. Connection doesn't begin with action. It begins with safety. And safety is rebuilt slowly, through consistency, not intensity. There is grief here. Not loud, not dramatic, but quiet. Grief for friendships that never formed, for bonds that dissolved before solidifying, for versions of you that never had space to emerge. This grief doesn't demand tears. It demands recognition. People without friends often mature early. They learn self-regulation before co-regulation, independence before interdependence. So while others experiment emotionally, you stabilize, and stability becomes your identity. But stability without connection can become isolation. Emotional independence is not the absence of need. It's the management of unmet need. You didn't stop needing connection. You stopped expecting it to be safe. That distinction matters. Healing does not mean suddenly becoming social. It means softening rigidity, allowing small moments of presence, low-risk connection, gentle consistency. Healing is incremental. It respects the nervous system. For someone like you, courage isn't loud. It's subtle. It's replying honestly, staying a little longer, not pulling away immediately. It's letting someone see a fraction more than feels comfortable. Even if solitude feels natural now, it was never meant to be permanent. Humans are wired for witness, not crowds, not constant interaction. But being known, you don't erase solitude. You integrate it. You keep the self-awareness, the depth, the independence. But you loosen the armor, just enough. Hope doesn't announce itself. It waits. In moments when connection feels slightly less threatening, when presence doesn't overwhelm, when you don't immediately withdraw. Hope is subtle, but it's there. If this video found you, it isn't because something is wrong with you. It's because something happened to you, and you adapted. You survived. And survival deserves compassion, not judgment. You were never broken. You were protecting something tender. And when you're ready, connection won't feel like danger anymore. It will feel like recognition.